Pella, capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia, 356 BC. It is night, and inside the royal palace, something is happening. Philip II, king of the Macedonians, is far away on a military campaign, besieging the city of Potidaea. But in Pella, his wife Olympias has just given birth to a boy, and it is at this very instant, so say the ancient accounts, though with an obvious touch of legend constructed afterward, that three pieces of news reached the distant king at the same time. His general Parmenion has defeated the Illyrians in battle, his horses have won at the Olympic Games, and his son has just been born. A seer, hearing all this, is said to have declared that a child born amidst three victories would be destined for invincibility. Royal propaganda nonsense? Perhaps. But this is how the story of Alexander begins to be told, and it is how we will tell it now, as if we were there, peeking from behind the palace columns, watching this boy grow into the man who would redraw the map of the ancient world. There is Alexander, still small, sitting on the cold marble floor of the palace, listening to his mother Olympias tell stories. Olympias, princess of Epirus, is an intense woman, devoted to the Dionysian cults, and she nurtures in the boy the belief that he is not only Philip's son, that he descends, through mythic lineage, from Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War, and also from Heracles, the demigod. She whispers these stories into the boy's ear every night, and something of them sticks. Alexander grows up carrying the Iliad as if it were a manual for living. Later, as an adult, he will sleep with a copy of Homer's work, annotated by Aristotle himself, under his pillow, alongside a dagger. Some chroniclers say he considered that copy his most precious possession throughout the entire military campaign. Behold him now, around 7 or 8 years old, watching his father's grooms trying to tame a wild horse, a huge animal with dark coat, and a white mark on its forehead shaped like an ox's head, hence the name Bucephalus, ox head. Philip's men try to mount it, one by one, and the horse throws them off, enraged. Philip, irritated, orders the animal sent away, saying it is too wild, useless. And there is the boy Alexander, watching with almost clinical attention, noticing something the adults missed. The horse is not angry at people. It is afraid of its own shadow, which looms and moves before it as it struggles. Alexander asks for the chance to try. He turns the animal to face the sun, so the shadow falls behind it, out of its field of vision, and begins to calm it slowly, whispering, stroking its neck. In minutes, he is mounted. Legend has it, and this particular one has support in multiple ancient sources, such as Plutarch, that Philip, seeing this, wept with emotion and told his son, "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedonia is too small." Bucephalus would become Alexander's warhorse for nearly 20 years, until it died of old age or battle wounds, depending on the source. In India, at which point Alexander, devastated, would found a city in its honor, Bucephala. Now the scene shifts. Philip, a pragmatic and visionary king, decides his son needs the best possible education, and he summons none other than Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, disciple of Plato, one of the greatest thinkers humanity has ever produced, to be the prince's personal tutor. The two settle into a secluded retreat at the Nymphaeum of Mysa, a sanctuary dedicated to the nymphs, surrounded by gardens and grottos. There is Alexander, sitting under the trees, listening to Aristotle speak of philosophy, medicine, logic, politics, zoology, botany. The boy absorbs everything hungrily. Aristotle teaches him biology with such intensity that, years later, already on campaign in Asia, Alexander will send soldiers to collect specimens of exotic plants and animals to send back to his teacher, a gesture many historians point to as one of the first recorded scientific expeditions in history, motivated by pure curiosity combined with devotion to that professor. But there is a tension there, silent, growing with the years. Aristotle teaches that barbarian peoples, that is, non-Greeks, are naturally inferior and should be treated almost as instruments, and that Greeks should rule over them, never intermingling with them. Alexander absorbs this lesson in childhood, and, decades later, it is precisely this teaching that he will betray, dramatically and controversially, by adopting Persian customs, marrying Persian women, and attempting to fuse cultures, a decision that will revolt his own Macedonian generals, who see him orientalizing before their very eyes. 336 BC. Let us go to the theater at Aegae, where the wedding of Alexander's sister is being celebrated. Philip II enters the arena alone, without bodyguards nearby, a deliberate gesture of confidence to show the people he has loved that he fears nothing. And then, amidst the crowd, one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, lunges forward and drives a dagger into the king's chest. Philip falls dead on the spot, in front of everyone. The assassin tries to flee, but trips on a vine and is killed on the spot by Alexander's companions, which, conveniently, prevents any interrogation about who else might have been behind the plot. And here lies one of the greatest unsolved enigmas of ancient history. Who ordered Philip killed? Pausanias's motives seem personal, a humiliation suffered years earlier, one which Philip himself had refused to remedy. But historians to this day debate whether Olympias, resentful at having been set aside when Philip took a new Macedonian wife, had a hand in the plot. And some suspect, whispered, never proven, that Alexander himself, fearing he would be disinherited in favor of a possible heir from that new wife, may have known something, or at least not cared to prevent it. None of this has ever been confirmed. But there stands Alexander, just 20 years old, suddenly and violently crowned king of Macedonia, on a throne still warm with his father's blood, surrounded by internal and external enemies betting the boy won't last 6 months in power. He proves them wrong with calculated brutality. In the first weeks, he eliminates any potential rival to the throne, including relatives of his own. Then he marches south, crushes any Greek revolt daring to think that Philip's death means freedom, and destroys Thebes almost completely as an example, leaving only the house of the poet Pindar standing, a theatrical, almost performative gesture, showing that he respects culture even as he razes entire cities. 334 BC. Behold him on the coast, before the Hellespont, about to cross into Asia at the head of an army of perhaps 35,000 men against the gigantic Persian Empire, which had reigned for generations over most of the known world. Even before disembarking, Alexander hurls his own spear toward the Asian shore, a symbolic gesture declaring that that land is already, spiritually, his, taken by the spear, as the Greeks said of territory conquered by right of conquest. And then he does something strange, something revealing how much his mind lived within the mythology Olympias had implanted in him as a child. He detours to the ruins of Troy. There he is, running naked beside Achilles' tomb, his supposed mythical ancestor, paying funeral honors, while his closest companion, and, according to many modern historians, also his lover, Hephaestion, runs to the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion in the Iliad. It is a gesture heavy with meaning. Alexander is not merely going to war. He is consciously staging his own version of a Greek myth, with himself in the role of the hero. We arrive at one of the most famous scenes, and one of the most revealing of Alexander's temperament. In the city of Phrygia, there is an ancient ox cart, tied to a post by an extraordinarily complex knot, made of cornel bark cords intertwined in such a way that no one had ever been able to identify where it began or ended. Local legend says that whoever undid the Gordian knot would become lord of all Asia. Generations of men tried and failed. There stands Alexander, before the knot, surrounded by his generals and a curious crowd eager to see the young king fail like all the others. He examines the knot for a moment, and then, without ceremony, without hesitation, draws his sword and simply cuts it in half. Some ancient accounts say he found a hidden pin that would have released the knot more elegantly. Most, however, support the more dramatic version. He solved by brute force a problem no one could solve by logic. It is practically a summary of Alexander's entire philosophy of life in a single scene. When an elegant solution does not exist, create one through audacity. 333 BC, on the plain of Issus, in modern-day Turkey. There stands the Persian army, commanded by the great King Darius III himself, vastly outnumbering the Macedonians, perhaps over 100,000 men against barely over 40,000. But Darius makes a fatal positioning error, cornering his own enormous army in a narrow space between mountains and sea, where numbers cease to be an advantage. Alexander spots the gap and attacks with his elite cavalry directly toward Darius. The great king, seeing death approach, panics, abandons his war chariot, mounts a horse, and flees the battlefield, leaving behind not only his collapsing army, but his own mother, wife, and daughters, captured by the Macedonians. And here is one of the most surprising, lesser-known, and character-revealing moments of the entire campaign. Alexander treats the women of the Persian royal family with extraordinary respect. He does not enslave them, does not humiliate them publicly as one might expect from a conqueror of the time. Darius's mother, Sisygambes, even develops something close to genuine maternal affection for Alexander, and, according to ancient accounts, will be so devastated by his death, years later, that she will let herself starve to death in grief. It is a human, almost intimate detail, hidden within a narrative of war and conquest. 331 BC. Alexander detours his campaign to one of the most remote and inhospitable places imaginable, the oasis of Siwa, isolated in the middle of the Egyptian desert, to consult the oracle of Ammon, a deity the Greeks associated with Zeus. It is a brutal journey, days crossing scorching sand, with accounts of sandstorms that nearly destroy the entire expedition, and a passage, told by various chroniclers in slightly different ways, about ravens, or, in another version, serpents, that supposedly guided the army back on course when they were completely lost. Alexander enters the sanctuary alone. No one knows exactly what happened inside. He never publicly revealed the full conversation he had with the priest. But he emerges and lets slip, to a few, that the oracle hailed him as son of Ammon, that is, son of a god. From that moment on, something changes profoundly in Alexander. He begins to cultivate, increasingly openly, the idea of his own divine nature. He comes to demand, on some occasions at court, that visitors perform proskynesis, a prostration gesture that Persians reserved for their kings, but which Greeks considered something due only to gods, never to men. His Macedonian generals, proud and of egalitarian tradition among comrades in arms, grow deeply uncomfortable. It is the beginning of a fracture that will deepen year after year between the Alexander he was and the Alexander he is becoming. 331 BC, on the plains of Mesopotamia, Darius has assembled an even larger army than at Issus, scythed chariots, war elephants from India, a monumental force of perhaps over 200,000 men. He personally chose flat, open terrain, ideal for mass cavalry maneuvers, correcting the error made at Issus. There is Alexander, on the night before the battle, and his generals, nervous about the staggering numerical disparity, suggest a surprise night attack. Alexander refuses. He wants to win in broad daylight, clearly, without trickery, so that no one can later say he won by some cheap trick in the dark. Is it pride? Strategy? Probably both at once. He sleeps deeply that night, so deeply that his general Parmenion must wake him the next morning, which intrigues the soldiers. How can the king sleep so well on the eve of the greatest battle of his life? On the field, Alexander uses a daring maneuver. He advances obliquely, forcing Darius to stretch his lines, and then identifies the exact moment a gap opens in the enemy formation, near where the great king himself stands. He personally leads the cavalry wedge through that breach, directly toward Darius. And again, Darius panics and flees, a decision that will cost him his crown and, eventually, his life, assassinated months later by his own nobles, still fleeing Alexander to the very end. We are now at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the symbolic heart of the power the Persians had used centuries earlier to invade and burn Greek temples, including the Acropolis of Athens. Alexander enters the city, seizes the royal treasury, a sum so vast that, according to ancient accounts, thousands of mules and camels would be needed just to transport it. And then, on a night of heavy drinking, something happens that historians still debate today, whether accident, calculated vengeance, or a decision made in collective intoxication. The magnificent palace of Persepolis is set ablaze. A tradition, recounted by several ancient chroniclers, attributes the literal spark to an Athenian courtesan named Thaís, who, amidst the festivities, incited those present to burn the palace as symbolic vengeance for the destruction of Greek temples decades earlier, and Alexander, garlanded, was said to have been the first to hurl a burning torch at the palace curtains. Later historians debate whether it was indeed an impulsive act of drunkenness or a cold political decision, disguised as a festive accident, to symbolically end the Persian Empire as a political entity. Either way, the fire consumes one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, and, centuries later, archaeologists still find at the ruins of Persepolis layers of ash and chard, would confirming the violence of that conflagration. Here the narrative darkens. As the years advance and Alexander adopts more and more Persian customs, Oriental dress, the harem, court ceremonial, the tension with his oldest Macedonian companions turns into pure venom. Philotas, son of the highly respected general Parmenion, is accused of knowing of a conspiracy against Alexander's life and not warning him in time. He is tortured and executed, and then, fearing retaliation from the grieving father, who commands important troops in another region, Alexander also orders Parmenion killed, one of the most loyal generals his own father Philip had ever had, without any trial whatsoever. It is one of the coldest and most calculating acts of his entire career, and it permanently stains his relationship with the old Macedonian guard. Worse still, on a night of heavy drinking, amid a heated argument about loyalty and who truly built the army's victories, Alexander, seized by rage, kills with his own hands, with a spear, his childhood friend Clytus the Black, the same man who years earlier had saved his life in battle, deflecting the sword blow that would have killed him. It is said that, in the next instant, Alexander falls into despair, tries to kill himself with the same spear, and spends days locked away, refusing to eat, devastated by his own irreversible act. It is a raw portrait of a brilliant man being devoured from within by the combination of absolute power, alcohol, and growing paranoia that everyone, even the closest, might be plotting against him. 327 BC onward, Alexander pushes the army ever deeper into the Indian subcontinent, facing King Porus, who commands a line of war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes, a confrontation so hard that, according to accounts, left Alexander deeply impressed by the courage of the defeated Porus, to the point of returning his very kingdom to him as a vassal, rather than humiliating him. But there, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, something unprecedented happens. For the first time in the entire campaign, Alexander's army refuses to go on. The soldiers, who had been marching for nearly a decade, crossed deserts, frozen mountains, and now faced torrential monsoon rains, war elephants, and the prospect of still more unknown lands ahead, simply stop. It is not a violent rebellion. It is something more silent and more devastating to Alexander's pride, a collective, wordless refusal to take another step. He locks himself in his tent for 3 days, furious, hoping they will relent. They do not, and, for the first and only time in his entire adult life, Alexander is forced to retreat. It is a scene laden with almost tragic irony. The man who conquered the greatest empire ever seen is finally halted not by an enemy army, but by the exhaustion and homesickness of his own men. The return journey through the Gadrosian Desert, in modern-day Pakistan and Iran, is one of the darkest and least glamorized chapters of the entire saga. Historians debate whether Alexander chose this brutal route out of pride, wanting to accomplish a crossing that, according to legend, even the legendary Queen Semiramis or Cyrus the Great himself had not survived intact, or out of logistical necessity to coordinate with the naval fleet. The result is catastrophic: unbearable heat, lack of water, sudden sandstorms that bury men and animals alive during sleep. A large part of the army, women, children accompanying the expedition, veteran soldiers who had survived. Alexander's reaction is a grief so excessive that it frightens even his own men. He throws himself over his friend's body and refuses to rise for hours, cuts his own hair in mourning, literally imitating the scene from the Iliad where Achilles cuts his hair for Patroclus's death, has the physician who treated Hephaestion crucified, accusing him of negligence, orders the manes and tails of all the army's horses and mules to be cut in collective mourning, and, more extremely, orders the destruction of a local temple dedicated to Asclepius, god of medicine, as if trying to punish the gods themselves for not saving his friend. Modern historians point to this episode as one of the clearest signs that, in the last months of his life, Alexander was no longer in full emotional control, perhaps exhausted, perhaps chronically alcoholic, perhaps simply destroyed inside after years of uninterrupted war and loss. June 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander, only 32 years old, is planning his next campaign, this time against Arabia, when he begins to feel intense fevers after a night of heavy feasting and drinking. The following days are a clinical mystery that historians and physicians still debate today. Over 2,000 years later, the fever does not subside. He progressively loses the ability to speak, then to move, while his generals, increasingly desperate, begin to file before the royal chamber to see him perhaps for the last time. And here is one of the most haunting details of this entire story. According to a modern medical study published decades ago, which gained great repercussion, it is possible that Alexander was not actually dead at the moment he was declared dead. The theory, dubbed ascending paralysis, associated with a rare variant of Guillain-Barré syndrome, possibly triggered by a bacterial infection, suggests that he could have become completely paralyzed, unable to move or signal that he was still conscious, while his body was being prepared for embalming. According to this intriguing and disturbing theory, it is possible that Alexander the Great was declared dead and began to be embalmed while, technically, he was still alive inside a body that no longer responded. A curious detail reinforces this theory. Ancient accounts mention that his body showed no visible signs of decomposition for several days after death, something that, at the time, was interpreted as further proof of his divine nature, but which some researchers today see as medical evidence that actual biological death had not yet occurred. When his generals, overcome with desperation, finally ask Alexander, on the brink of death and barely able to articulate words, to whom he leaves his gigantic empire, the answer recorded by Plutarch is enigmatic, almost cruel in its ambiguity. To the strongest, in Greek, toi kratistoi. A single word would have decided, or rather deliberately not decided, the fate of an entire empire. With no designated adult heir, no clear successor, this ambiguous phrase will unleash decades of bloody wars among his generals, the so-called Wars of the Diadochi, that will fragment the empire into several rival kingdoms, many of which will last for centuries, shaping the entire history of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the story does not end with the death. On the contrary, a nearly macabre dispute begins. The general Ptolemy, who inherits Egypt in the partition of the empire, literally hijacks Alexander's funeral cortege, diverting it from its planned destination, probably Pella or the Oracle of Siwa, and taking the embalmed body to Egypt, where he displays it as the supreme symbol of political legitimacy. The body is eventually installed in a sumptuous mausoleum in Alexandria, the very city Alexander had founded. For centuries, the tomb becomes a pilgrimage site. Julius Caesar visits. The Emperor Augustus, according to ancient accounts, accidentally broke the nose of the mummy while trying to touch it. The Emperor Caligula supposedly stole Alexander's breastplate from the tomb to wear it. And then, at some point between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, amid invasions, earthquakes, regime changes, and the political chaos of the late Roman Empire, references to the tomb simply vanish from historical records. No one knows exactly when or how the site was lost. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of world archaeology. The tomb of one of the most famous men who ever lived, lost, somewhere beneath the bustling streets of modern Alexandria. Or perhaps completely destroyed, its ashes scattered, never to be recovered. And it is precisely here that the search continues, very much alive, to this day. Very recently, Greek archaeologists revealed, for the first time, the complete external structure of a gigantic funerary monument known as the Casta tomb, at Amphipolis in northern Greece, a complex encircled by approximately 500 meters of circumference, enclosing a massive burial mound of over 20 acres. Although researchers have already ruled out that it is Alexander himself buried there, the hypothesis raised is that the tomb was built for someone extremely close to him, perhaps his mother, one of his wives, or an intimate friend. And it is not the only recent discovery. In early 2026, archaeologists announced they had located the remains of Alexandria on the Tigris, a city founded by Alexander near the Persian Gulf in modern-day Iraq, one more among the more than 20 cities he named after himself along the campaign. Another recent and revealing discovery comes from an unlikely place, an ancient military camp identified as Kandar Tepe in southeastern Uzbekistan, which archaeologists for years considered merely a small, insignificant settlement. Using modern technologies, magnetometry, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery combined with excavations, researchers identified there a defensive ditch approximately 400 meters long, encircling an area of about 1.2 hectares, revealing that the Greek military presence in Central Asia, in the period after Alexander's death, was much more organized and enduring than previously imagined, proof that the legacy of the conquest spread and took root far beyond what ancient accounts suggested. And it is with this mixture of grandeur and ruin, of military genius and devastating human fragility, that we close this story. Alexander was not merely the brilliant general who never lost a pitched battle, a truly extraordinary and historically verified feat. He was also a man who, as a child, fell in love with stories of heroes and spent his entire life trying to live inside them, who wept uncontrollably at the death of a friend, who killed another friend in a drunken rage and never fully forgave himself, who fused cultures with a surprisingly modern vision of integration, at the same time as he demanded to be treated as a living god, who conquered lands as far as his own feet would carry him, and only stopped because the men following him, exhausted, refused to take another step. 32 years of life, barely over 12 years of reign, and yet, enough to redraw the map of 3 continents, spread Greek language and culture across a territory stretching from Macedonia to the banks of the Indus River, found dozens of cities that still exist today, and leave a mystery that archaeologists around the world continue to actively try to solve more than 2,300 years later. Alexander departed in 323 BC, but, in a way, we continue to this day digging the ground in search of him. That's the end. Thanks for watching. This is Lived Lines. See you next time.